On March 4, 2026, the United States Navy fired a torpedo in combat for the first time since World War II. Not a drone strike, not a missile salvo, a torpedo. The kind of weapon that sends an entire ship and every soul aboard straight to the bottom of the ocean. And that is just the beginning of what the mainstream media is not telling you about what is really happening in the Persian Gulf right now. Stay with me, because this is not a military story. This is a money story. This is a power story. And what is unfolding right now is about who controls the arteries of the global economy and who gets to decide when they bleed. Here is the conflict pair driving everything you are about to hear. On one side, the United States Navy, the most powerful naval force in human history, which just destroyed 95% of Iran's conventional naval power in a campaign unlike anything seen since the Second World War. On the other side, Iran, a regime that made a deliberate economic calculation to close the Strait of Hormuz, trigger a global oil price spike, and weaponize your fuel bill against your government's political will. A regime that lost its navy, but still has its missiles. And that distinction is the most important thing happening in this war right now. Here is what CNN is not telling you. Here is what the Pentagon briefings deliberately leave out. The Strait was never just about oil, and Iran's defeat at sea was never the end of this story. It was the beginning of a different and more dangerous one. Start with the geography, because numbers without context are just noise. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, roughly the distance from downtown Washington to Dulles Airport. And through that single suffocating choke point, approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil pass every single day. That represents 21% of global oil consumption. 1 in every 5 barrels of oil on this planet moves through that strip of water. Now close it. Just close it in your mind for a moment, because that is exactly what Iran did. And the consequences are sitting in your wallet right now, whether you realize it or not. On March 13, 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei delivered a statement on Iranian state television. His language was not ambiguous. The Strait, he announced, would be used as a direct pressure tool against the enemy. General Alireza Tangsidi, commander of the IRGC Navy, stepped forward moments later. Ships from the United States, Israel, and European nations would not be granted passage, full stop. And then he said something that should have ended careers in Tehran's strategic planning division. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If you have any doubts, come and test us." They came, and they tested. Within days, Iranian forces attacked 17 separate commercial tankers attempting to transit the strait. 6 of those vessels were rendered completely inoperable. One of them, the civilian tanker Mayori Nari, flying a Thai flag, was struck by explosive-laden unmanned surface vehicles while her crew was still evacuating. Even a Russian liquefied natural gas carrier was hit. Russia, Tehran's closest strategic partner, struck inside Iran's own declared exclusion zone. The regime could not control its own weapons, and that single detail reveals something about this conflict that no official statement has fully acknowledged. The United States Navy response was not proportional. It was annihilation. The USS Gerald Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln, 2 nuclear-powered supercarriers, were already positioned in the region. More than 60 Iranian naval vessels were struck. 16 mine-laying ships were specifically hunted down and eliminated before they could seed the strait floor with explosives that could not have been cleared for years. Think about what that means. If those 16 ships had completed their mission, the Strait of Hormuz would have been a minefield, impassable for years. And then came March 4th, the Iris Dana, one of Iran's most capable naval assets. Returning from a military exercise near Visakhapatnam, India, was tracked across the Indian Ocean, pursued southwest toward the coast of Sri Lanka, and sunk by a United States submarine torpedo. The first torpedo fired in combat since 1945. 95% of the Iranian Navy is now inoperable. Those are not estimates, those are the numbers. And the question that nobody in mainstream media is asking is the one that changes everything about how you understand this war. Why did Iran do this? Why now? To answer that, you need to go back to 1988. Operation Praying Mantis, April 18, 1988. In a single day, the United States Navy destroyed half of Iran's operational naval fleet in the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II. Half gone in hours. The USS Samuel B. Roberts had struck an Iranian mine. The response was surgical and devastating. American warships sank 2 Iranian frigates, destroyed 2 oil platforms used as military command posts, and eliminated multiple fast attack boats in engagements that lasted less than 8 hours. Iran lost more naval tonnage in one day than in the entire Iran-Iraq war that had consumed 8 years and hundreds of thousands of lives. That lesson was burned permanently into Iran's institutional military memory. You do not fight the United States Navy ship to ship, you will lose every single time. So for nearly 4 decades, Iran rebuilt around a completely different doctrine: asymmetric warfare, swarm tactics, drone fleets, ballistic missiles hidden inside mountain tunnels and underground bunkers carved into the coastal terrain overlooking the strait. The entire Iranian military architecture was redesigned around one purpose: making the cost of entry into the Persian Gulf too high for any conventional power to accept. The price had to be so severe that the political consequences at home would outweigh the military objectives abroad. That doctrine worked, until it did not. But here's the strategic miscalculation that analysts are only beginning to fully understand. And this is the part that changes everything about how you interpret this conflict. Iran did not stumble into this confrontation. Tehran made a deliberate economic calculation, and that calculation starts with one number, $85. That is the approximate price per barrel of crude oil that Iran requires to balance its national budget. Below that threshold, the regime cannot fund its military apparatus, cannot pay its security forces, cannot sustain the subsidy programs that keep domestic unrest at a manageable level. And in the months leading into this crisis, global oil prices were sitting dangerously close to that floor. Think about what that means. Iran was not primarily trying to win a military confrontation. Iran was trying to trigger a price spike, drive oil above $100 per barrel, send fuel prices surging across Europe and the United States, force Western governments to simultaneously manage military escalation and domestic economic pain. Tehran's calculation was brutally rational. Democracies collapse under inflation pressure faster than theocracies do. This was not a military strategy. This was a budget strategy wearing a military uniform. And it almost worked. Because every $10 increase in the global price of crude oil translates to approximately 24 cents added to every gallon of gasoline at your local pump. That is not an opinion. That is a mathematical relationship that energy economists have tracked for decades. When Iran closed the strait and oil prices pushed toward $100 per barrel, that number was not an abstraction on a trading screen. That was money being extracted directly from your wallet every single time you filled your tank. But fuel is only the beginning. Think about everything that moves through that strait. Crude oil, yes, but also liquefied natural gas, petrochemicals, the raw materials that feed fertilizer production across South Asia and East Africa. When those supply chains fracture, the disruption does not stay in the Gulf. It travels. It compounds. Fertilizer prices spike. Food production costs climb. And within 2 to 3 agricultural cycles, that disruption shows up as higher prices on grocery store shelves in cities that have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 30% of global container shipping is either directly routed through the Persian Gulf region or priced against energy benchmarks directly, affected by Gulf stability. Your smartphone, your appliances, the components inside the car you drive, all of it carries a hidden Persian Gulf premium when this region destabilizes. Tehran understood every single one of these connections. Iran's strategic planners were not targeting American warships as their primary objective. They were targeting the political will of Western populations. The calculation was precise and coldly rational. If ordinary citizens in Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States are simultaneously paying record fuel prices, watching their grocery bills climb, and being told their government is spending billions on a naval conflict in a distant strait, the domestic political pressure becomes almost unbearable. Tehran was not just targeting ships, it was targeting your government's approval rating. Now here is where the story gets exponentially more dangerous. And this is the part that should make every person watching this lean forward in their seat. China. While Iranian and American forces exchanged fire across the Persian Gulf, Chinese-flagged vessels were moving through the chaos with something approaching immunity. Ships like the Iron Maiden and Sino-Ocean activated their automatic identification systems loudly and prominently, broadcasting their Chinese identity like a digital shield. And it worked. Iranian targeting systems left them alone because Beijing and Tehran have a relationship that runs far deeper than public statements suggest. Intelligence analysts are looking very carefully at whether Beijing quietly signaled to Tehran that China could absorb significant oil supply disruptions before the first Iranian mine was ever loaded onto a ship, because the arithmetic of this crisis is extraordinarily convenient for Chinese interests. Western energy markets are destabilized, American military resources are stretched and committed to the Gulf, and China continues purchasing Iranian crude at a reported discount of nearly 30% below market rates, while European buyers are paying emergency premiums and, while scrambling for alternative supplies, Beijing is not in this crisis. Beijing is shopping during this crisis. The China dimension goes deeper than oil discounts. Intelligence reports describe a $5 billion arms transaction between Beijing and Tehran that includes CM-302. Anti-ship missiles, the export designation for the Chinese carrier killer, as well as surface-to-air missile batteries and kamikaze drone systems. Every weapon China sells to Iran that gets used against American naval assets is a weapon that depletes American interceptor stockpiles without China firing a single shot. Every SM-6 interceptor that an American destroyer expends stopping a Chinese-supplied missile is an interceptor not available for the Pacific contingency that China is ultimately preparing for. Beijing has constructed a situation where Iran fights America's Navy with Chinese weapons, while China buys Iran's oil at a 30% discount, and watches American magazine depth decline from a comfortable distance. That is not opportunism, that is strategy. For the oil workers across the Persian Gulf, For the sailors aboard commercial tankers calculating whether to attempt transit or divert thousands of kilometers around Africa. For the ordinary families in South Asia watching fertilizer prices climb and food costs follow. This economic warfare is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a harvest and a shortage, between a government that can afford its promises and one that cannot, between a fuel price your paycheck can absorb and one that forces a choice between filling the tank and paying the rent. And there is one more detail that reveals just how completely this situation spiraled beyond Tehran's control. Among the vessels struck inside the Iranian exclusion zone was a Russian liquefied natural gas carrier. Russia, the one major power that Iran desperately needed to remain neutral and sympathetic. The regime did not discriminate. It could not discriminate. Its asymmetric warfare doctrine is not a precision instrument. It is a blunt tool that generates chaos indiscriminately. And chaos, once released, does not take orders from the government that released it. By the time Iranian military commanders understood the full scope of what they had set in motion, 95% of their conventional naval assets were gone. Their mine-laying fleet was destroyed before it could complete its mission. Their surviving ships were fleeing across the Indian Ocean toward foreign ports, seeking refuge in countries thousands of kilometers from home. The budget strategy had become a catastrophe, but the missiles in the mountains, those are still there. And this is where every serious analyst is focused right now. Because Iran's remaining arsenal is not small. The Fateh hypersonic missile, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 13, and specifically designed to defeat ballistic missile defense systems. The Kaibashi, a solid-fuel ballistic missile with a range of 1,450 kilometers, that can reach targets across the entire Middle East without exposing a single launch vehicle to preemptive strike. The Sajal, the dancing missile that changed direction at Mach 10 and broke through every defense system. Deployed in this theater just days ago, these weapons require no port, no surface fleet, no exposed naval infrastructure that can be photographed from satellite and destroyed before dawn. They require only a mountain, a tunnel, and a targeting solution. And Iran has all three in quantities that American planners have not fully neutralized. The United States military has now entered Phase 2 satellites, high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, advanced bombers systematically eliminating radar installations, drone launch centers, and underground command networks buried inside Iranian coastal terrain. It is complex, it is costly, and it is extraordinarily long-term. Nobody is declaring victory. Nobody can, because here's the strategic reality that this war has produced. Iran's navy is gone. Iran's mine-laying capability is gone. Iran's ability to project conventional power beyond the Persian Gulf is finished. But the ballistic missiles and the mountain tunnels remain. And a regime that has lost everything conventional has every incentive to use the weapons it still has, not because it believes it can win, but because the alternative is accepting a defeat so total that the political consequences at home may be more dangerous than the military consequences of escalating further. Trump told reporters that Iran wants to make a deal. Not we won. Not they are defeated. Iran wants to make a deal. That is a negotiating frame from a man who understands that 95% naval destruction is not the same as political submission. But here is why that deal is harder than it sounds. The man on the other side of that negotiation is Mojtaba Khomeini, a leader whose regime just lost its navy, whose regime cannot balance its budget below $85 oil, whose father was killed in the opening strikes of this war, and whose first public speech as supreme leader contained 5 explicit military threats and no diplomatic off-ramp. A man negotiating from grief, from ideology, and from a military position that still includes hypersonic missiles pointed at every American ally in the region. The deal frame exists. The back channel is open. But the distance between what Trump calls acceptable terms and what Khomeini can accept without losing the domestic legitimacy that keeps him in power is a distance that no negotiating session has yet closed. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because when Phase 2 of this campaign reaches the mountain bunkers where Iran's remaining missiles are hidden, when the negotiation that Trump described produces either a framework or a breakdown, when the economic pressure on Western populations reaches the political threshold that Tehran calculated from the beginning, this is where you will hear what it all actually means. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Iran's remaining missile arsenal gives it enough leverage to negotiate a deal that preserves the regime? Or has 95% naval destruction already made that outcome impossible?